Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And today we're going to be talking once again about the latest with Hurricane Lee, as finally, after several days of anticipation, it is now making its northward turn and heading directly towards the coastline of Maine, as well as the Canadian coastlines of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. We also have some activity out to the east of Hurricane Lee. We've been talking about it briefly, but we have Hurricane Margot that continues to churn and move northward as well. This is expected to weaken over the next several days as it continues its northward trajectory. This is not expected to impact land. It's only going to be impacting the fishies. So that in of itself is a fish storm. But then there's also another area of concern. See all this convection out towards the African coastline? That is an Atlantic that is really starting to wake up here as we get into the latter half of the hurricane season. So we're really going to be breaking down today Hurricane Lee and the latest on that, as well as its potential impacts to the lower 48 and the Canadian provinces. But then we'll also take a brief look towards the very end of this video in talking about some invest activity that might be our next hurricane. Could potentially be Hurricane Nigel down the road. So if you do enjoy the content, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends who will likely be impacted by Hurricane Lee. That goes for folks in New England as well as the Canadian provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. One last announcement that I want to get out here before we get started with the video. I mentioned this a couple of videos ago. As a reminder, if we hit 1,000 subscribers, and it's really not a matter of if, but when, right? When we do hit 1,000 subscribers, I will be cutting off all this hair, right? This is just a complete forest on top of my head. I call it a bird's nest, really. This whole bird's nest on top of my head is going to be shaved off, and whatever hair that we collect from that is going to be donated to the charities that collect hair for pediatric cancer patients. So it's a very, very good cause. I would strongly recommend, let's push to get to 1,000 subscribers. I would say by the end of next month is a pretty reasonable goal. So that way I will do that on live stream. I will literally live stream myself having my hair buzzed off and then donated to, I don't really know what charity I'm going to donate it to yet, but it's going to be one that does accept hair for children with pediatric cancer that have lost their hair. Also, this channel will not be monetized. I want to make that very clear. I will not be collecting money once we do become monetized. So I will have memberships available to folks that do want to sign up for that, as well as accepting donations. But I will not be collecting that. 100% of the proceeds will go to charities. We'll work on that once we get down the road, but just wanted to get those announcements out there before we get started. Number one, 1,000 subscribers. I'm cutting off all of my hair on live stream. You guys will laugh at me and watch me do it. And it won't actually be me cutting it. It'll be somebody else. And then we'll donate that to a charity that collects hair for children with pediatric cancer. Again, that's at 1,000 subscribers. And also, this channel will not be monetized. This is part of our consulting company called Prestige Weather, which you can check out here in the bio below. But this is a free platform. It's going to provide free content. I will probably collect money for memberships and donations, but that will, again, go to charity. I am not going to be profiting off this channel. So the only thing that I make money on is the consulting part, and that's it. So just wanted to get that out of the way, those two announcements. And with that being said, let's get right into today's video. All right, folks, we're going to start by taking a look at the latest water vapor imagery courtesy of the College of DuPage Meteorology webpage. That is a mouthful. we will start with our attention towards Hurricane Lee as that continues to move in a north-northwest trajectory, and that is expected to eventually move north-northeast. And the reason why that is because take a look. We've been talking about this feature for the last couple of days, but this is our shortwave trough that is continuing to move off to the east. And if you notice, you can actually see a cold front with that. Take a look at the water vapor, right? Notice these lighter colors. This is indicating dry air. So our cold front is demarcated on that line. And this is going to help to steer it more north-northeast as it continues to accelerate in the north-northwest trajectory. In addition to that, we also have an area of dry air aloft that's noted on the western flank of Hurricane Lee. This is also leading to the weakening of the system as it continues northward. We are expecting, too, that Hurricane Lee will increase in speed and its acceleration going forward, and it's going to be because of that shortwave trough that moves off to the east. That's going to steer it north-northeast. But it's also going to be because of that clockwise flow with our upper level ridge that will help to steer it as well. So we're not trying to get too far ahead of ourselves, folks, but I did want to mention that we are anticipating it to speed up over the next couple of days and over time, and we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Some honorable mentions. We have Hurricane Margot that continues to be a fish storm and is weakening as it continues its northward trajectory as well. As it increases its northerly latitude, we are expecting it to encounter cooler and cooler waters and then eventually weaken down below a tropical storm. This is not expected to impact land whatsoever. It is off into the ocean and is expected to impact the fishies, and that's about it. But we also have another area of concern. We have talked about Lee for the last few days, but as Lee continues to progress northward, we will then turn our attention to this area of convection off the coast of Africa. This is in a very favorable environment, and it is expected to develop what will eventually be Tropical Storm Nigel as we get into the next several days. More on that later in the video, and by the way, just like with our other videos, we will have bookmarks that will notate which chapters you're watching. So if you want more information about that particular system, you can head on over to the end of the video and we will go more into detail. Going forward though, let's talk more about Hurricane Lee. And as we mentioned, it's going to continue its northerly trajectory, right? And as it does so, not only is it encountering that shortwave trough that's bringing with it a lot of bulk shear. Remember, hurricanes don't like bulk shear. It's also going to be going into cooler and cooler waters. Now, we mentioned this in yesterday's video. We do have some very cold waters off the coast of Maine and Nova Scotia. By the time it makes its way northward, it's going to be encountering cooler and cooler temperatures. It would have already encountered some pretty strong wind shear in association with that shortwave trough, and now it's just going into a more stable environment. So I would say this right now, I think we can be rest assured that this will not be a major hurricane. We're not talking about a Category 5 by the time it gets up that way. This is going to be below major thresholds and likely going to be fluctuating between a tropical storm and a hurricane. Really not trying to get ahead of myself this video, but I just want to give you some foreshadowing here that we are not expecting this to be anything more than, say, a Cat 1 hurricane. And even that is on the higher end threshold of what we will likely witness once this does make landfall. Here is another wonderful map that I came across, guys. This is your 250 millibar to 850 millibar bulk shear. So what does this mean, okay? This is measuring the bulk wind shear from the upper level jet to the lower level jet. And it's taking sort of a combination of in between both of those layers. So it gives you a value of how much shear we're talking about. As I just mentioned, guys, hurricanes do not like wind shear whatsoever. It acts as a deterrent from any sort of strengthening within a system like Hurricane Lee. As I talked about here at the top of the video, here is your shortwave trough, and let me actually switch back to my pen here. Here is your shortwave trough positioned right over the Great Lakes region and is continuing to move eastward. These white lines that you see are denoting increases in wind shear. Anytime you see dashed turquoise lines, that's showing you decreases in wind shear. So if we were just looking at wind shear as a variable and not talking about sea surface temperatures or not talking about the dryness in the air, then this would demarcate more favorable conditions for tropical development, and an area along the coast of the Atlantic would not favor that. But keep in mind, there's other variables when it comes to hurricane development, and this area has very cold water. So even though the shear is favorable, we still have very unfavorable sea surface temperatures off the coast of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But here's my point. As this moves north-northwest, and as I've already mentioned a couple times during this video, it is then anticipated to make a north-northeast turn as that front moves through and the shortwave trough moves through. In addition to that, as it's going rather northward, it is going to be encountering wind shear anywhere between, say, 40 to even upwards of 60 plus knots. That is a very unfavorable environment. And if it's not the shortwave trough we're talking about, it's this area off the coast of Bermuda that is also featuring some pretty strong wind shear as well. So I think you guys are getting the point, right? The reason why we're seeing the gradual weakening of Hurricane Lee, as we're expecting to see over these next few days, is because of the terrible wind shear the dryness to the western flank of Hurricane Lee, as we saw in the water vapor map, and then also our gradually decreasing sea surface temperatures as we move northward in latitude. I want to point your attention to the National Hurricane Center discussion very quickly because I find that it actually summarizes a lot of the points that we made during this video. It goes on to say, this is the latest advisory, by the way, from this morning, and it says that Lee continues to exhibit concentric eye walls, but there are some dry slots between those features. An SSMIS microwave image around 10Z showed that both eye walls were open. However, recent infrared satellite images indicate that the inner eye wall appears to be becoming better organized during the past few hours. The initial wind speed is held at 100 knots, but this is near the high end of the latest satellite intensity estimates. What it also mentions is, if we go down to the bottom, is that Lee is expected to gradually weaken as it moves into an environment of increasing vertical wind shear, slightly drier air, and over progressively cooler waters during the next few days. That being said, the large size of the hurricane suggests that the weakening process should be slow. And in addition to that, Lee is expected to grow in size as it gains latitude during the next few days. I want to take you guys back to this map for a second. If we just take sea surface temperatures, ignore the temperatures here, because I really want to drive home this point. If we are expecting Hurricane Lee to, let's say it makes landfall around, I don't know, Nova Scotia, right, in this area, as we increase our latitude northward with any system, in this case, Hurricane Lee, well, remember, we have cold air to the north, and then we have warm air to the south, right? These two differentiating air masses is what we call a horizontal temperature gradient. And so what we expect to happen with Hurricane Lee is, yes, it is expected to weaken over time, but as it moves northward in latitude, it's going to encounter more of this temperature gradient between the cold air mass to the northwest and the warm air mass to the southeast. Warm air mass being the hot sea surface temperatures we're observing, and the colder temperatures being more of that continental polar air mass. So what that's going to do is essentially expand the baroclinicity of Hurricane Lee. To translate that further, that means that the wind field that we see with Hurricane Lee is expected to cover a much broader area than what we're seeing right now. So let's say if we had a landfall that makes it over into Nova Scotia. Let's just say Nova Scotia takes a direct hit. Well, for our friends in Maine, that doesn't mean that you're not going to still feel the impacts of that. Because the wind field is expected to expand so greatly on the order of a few to several hundred miles, well, that means that you're going to be experiencing those same sustained winds as well. Of course, they are going to be stronger towards the center, but because that is expanding outward, you're expected to see some damaging winds as well. Of course, the question is going to be, how strong will Hurricane Lee be by the time it gets up towards the far New England area as well as the eastern Canadian provinces? Well, here's a look at Hurricane Lee right now, and as you can see, a pretty well-defined eye as opposed to what we saw this morning. Let me actually go ahead and fix that real quick. There we go. So here's the eye, as we can see on Hurricane Lee. The banding in between is rather weak. You notice how your convection is really not deep around the center. So we can even see, despite the fact that we have an eye, you do have some dry slots on the outer flank out towards the northeast as well as the west, where we are experiencing some drier air. But then you also have within the eye really rather weak banding here. It is rather deep in some spots, but it's not as consistent as what we saw when we were looking at a Category 5 out towards the Atlantic just a few days ago. So it is really showing some weakening, at least on the latest satellite imagery, and this is courtesy of Tropical Tidbits, and we are expecting to see this general trend continue through its weakening phase over these next couple of days. Here is the latest track and the model track guidance of Hurricane Lee. Pretty good consistency on this north-northeast trajectory, and then we are seeing a pretty high confidence that Nova Scotia will in fact be the one getting the direct hit from this. However, there are some models that take it a little bit more further off the coast and sort of in between Nova Scotia and Maine. As I just mentioned previously, guys, just because you're not experiencing a direct impact doesn't mean that you still won't feel the effects of Hurricane Lee. For example, for my friends in eastern Maine, I would expect at the moment, if this general trend remains on track, that we will still see some heavy rainfall, potentially some flooding in spots depending on the heaviness of those convective bands, as well as some sustained damaging winds as well, whether it's a tropical storm or a hurricane. Now, the tornado threat, as we talked about yesterday, in this particular scenario would be more confined to the eastern and northern flank of our hurricane, which would mean that Nova Scotia would be more under the gun for some of those brief spin-ups of tornadoes. And again, the big question mark is going to be, will it be a hurricane or will it be a tropical storm by the time it gets up this way? And here's the latest spread on that, right? It is hovering right around a Cat 2, a low-end major hurricane right now, but that is expected to deteriorate. As a matter of fact, if I was to just look at the current structure of it right now, I would tell you that it's probably going to be losing its major status by the time we get to tonight and early tomorrow morning. And then as we go into the rest of the weekend, very high model confidence in the general strength of this system and the trend of which it's going down. And you notice that by the time we get to about 84 to 96 hours, which is really going into this weekend and early next week, you notice that there is a pretty good confidence that Hurricane Lee will drop down to either a high-end tropical storm or a Category 1 hurricane. So I would say right now, at least just from what I'm observing, as well as the current conditions out ahead of it and downstream, would not be out of the question to see this be somewhere within the threshold of a very low-end Cat 1 and a mid to high-end tropical storm. It's actually very likely, based on the conditions we outlined in this video. Here is the latest track from the National Hurricane Center. We just talked about it, but this is just showing the cone of uncertainty. By the time we get to 8 a.m. Sunday is when we expect to see a landfall. Probably not going to be until late Saturday night into early Sunday morning for our friends in Nova Scotia as well as Maine. If it is still a hurricane by the time it gets up this way, it is only going to hold on to that status for so long. Once it does interact with land, remember we talked about this yesterday, it is going to be interacting with some higher elevation and some rough terrain. That, of course, leads to a frictional component, and that's just going to weaken it even further. So it is not expected to hold hurricane status very long, maybe temporarily, but by the time it makes landfall, it's really expected to be more so of a mid to high-end tropical storm, with the main threat being some sustained damaging winds, heavy rainfall, and maybe even a couple of spin-ups of tornadoes as well. Can't rule out some swells and some rip currents with this system, but the tide shouldn't be too high. Of course, we'll continue to monitor that as we get closer to the weekend. And finally, here is the big picture. We return to what was, of course, Hurricane Lee and what is Hurricane Lee as that continues to move north. We also have Hurricane Margot, as we talked about at the top of our discussion. That is going to really be a fishy storm, as we mentioned, and it's going to stay off and move to the north as well, and eventually decrease in strength and increase in latitude, and eventually become Tropical Storm Margot. Very little threat to the United States. Very little, if any, and I would actually just say there really isn't a threat at all. It is way too far away from the coast for any direct impact, so we can go ahead and just rule out Hurricane Margot for us, at least for now in the time being. Our next concern is going to be what happens out here. We do have a disturbance that we're looking at of convection off the African coast. You saw it on the top of our video. Large area of convection that's encompassing off the coast of Africa that's expected to consolidate and become our next tropical storm over the next potentially 5 days, with a 60% chance of development within that span. So this could potentially become Tropical Storm Nigel. And as far as what impacts it will have to the eastern seaboard in the United States, that still remains to be seen. It is still way too far out to determine a track with this. We are pretty confident that it is going to develop into our next tropical storm, maybe even a hurricane by the time we get into next week. But as far as where this goes beyond the middle of next week, we still just don't know yet. So we will continue to monitor this disturbance as it continues to strengthen out in the Atlantic, as well as track Hurricane Lee as it makes its way ever so closer to the eastern parts of the United States and our eastern provinces of Canada. So be sure to like and subscribe this video and share with family and friends, especially for those that will be impacted potentially by Hurricane Lee as it continues to move north. And I think I've said as it continues to move north like 30 times during this video. So yes, it is going to continue to move north. So for our friends here in Maine and Nova Scotia, you want to keep a very close eye on this. Be sure to share this video with those folks so they can get the information necessary. And with that being said, we will see you tomorrow on our next weather video.